Well, the first thing I just have to say is a huge thank you. I don't know about you, but I had to stand up a few minutes ago at the last break. If you need to stand up, I understand. I don't sit down this long very often in my life. And the other thing I need to say to you is that I made this presentation sitting on a log. So if there are any typos, balancing, I've become chair of Whole Education Trust, which I'm very proud of and very delighted to be working with. They're having a strategy day, and we were in a conference centre where we've replaced chairs and tables with logs, which was environmentally very friendly and exciting in all kinds of ways, but slightly challenging for balancing. The first thing I want to say is I first started working on research and evidence-informed practice in, I think 1989 was when I was first working on it. And we did a survey, and we asked teachers whether they had any contact with research, and 7% of teachers said they had anything to do with research. And do you know what? Nearly every one of them said they wouldn't let anyone know, because if they did, they'd be thought of as a swot. See how far we've come? Just listen to today. And I'm going to do a slightly different thing in this presentation, because I think one of the answers to the question about NICE and so on is we need to develop clarity about what different kinds of research do, and the role of systematic technical reviews and meta-analyses in helping us to get an overview. In education, we had the Campbell collaboration following the Cochrane collaboration, and now we've got EEF and so on doing it. And I normally spend my life talking about what comes out of systematic reviews, and I'm going to touch on one about how you lead fabulous continuing professional development and learning. Right, that's the and learning bit that's so important. But I got challenged by Johnny to focus on something different, and this has involved me in putting different strands of learning and research from systematic reviews together in some kind of thinking. And basically, I've been worrying at and around the metacognition point for a very long time. Although everybody's talking a lot and thinking a lot about metacognition, actually there isn't a lot of evidence it's really working. The cognitive science poses some really big questions about whether even transfer of learning from one environment to another is possible, jury out. But there's a new review that I've been involved in coming out from EEF in the next 10 days that helps to cast a bit of light on that. But I did a big study for Teach First, comparing what was happening in really exceptional schools, completely transforming the lives of children in really challenging communities, and schools that were transforming lives in less challenged communities, and also schools that were just doing a great job in those communities a few years ago. And one of the things even the exceptional schools were saying was that this metacognition point was still one of the wicked learning issues they were still struggling with. That not only is it challenging to happen, to make happen or enable to happen, but actually things in the national curriculum and the way the system was going actually created some obstacles that everyone was having to get out of the way. So I was thinking about that hard. I then produced, just as lockdown, a fortnight before lockdown started, the day after I went down with COVID, I actually was published a systematic review about developing great leadership of continuing professional development and learning. And that has quite a lot to say about metacognition. Well, it did for me. Let's see if it does that for you. And then another thing I got to do, which was extraordinary, was go to South Korea. Now, South Korea, 20 years ago, was one of the smallest economies in the world. Now it's, I think it was 10th, and now it's one of the 10th biggest economies in the world. And do you know what they put that down to? Education. How about that? They had very few years of statutory education then. Now, 83% of the population get to do degrees in good universities. 83% of the population. And that's down to teachers and teaching and learning. Very exciting. There are lots of things about South Korea I wouldn't recommend. The week before I went out there, the parents were out in the streets rioting because a new law had been introduced banning them from sending children under 8 to cramming schools after 11 o'clock at night. So I'm not saying South Korea's got it all right, but it did make me stop and think about metacognition. So I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to start with the story of the teacher I had in my mind when Alf was talking to, Alf is the teacher, when John was challenging us to, was it John or, no, who was it who was challenging us to think of a really fabulous teacher? Kovan, yeah. So this is Alf Coles, and Alf Coles wanted, he was a great mathematician, he was a great maths teacher, but he understood he had a wicked learning issue he couldn't tackle. He realised that every year in year 7, he would have all these enthusiastic new mathematicians, and he would lose them the minute he started on algebra. And he said to me, I can't understand it. He said, I just can't understand it. For me, algebra is like the lettering at the beginning of the Star Wars film. You can tell this is a long time ago. Good research lasts, I think. And so he started on an inquiry project, working with a tutor, coach, and also with a fellow history teacher, similarly engaged. And they did one of those a bit like Monty Python, you know. What has algebra ever done for the world? Like, what did the Romans ever do for us? What have great algebraists ever done for the world? Really important questions. And he studied that with his students. So he was a learner alongside them, as was his tutor, as was the history teacher. And as they started to see what these fascinating great algebraists had done for the world, they started to figure out who they were and how they thought and how their thinking registered in their behaviour and their communication. And these are some of the things that they started to see. Things that look like the beginnings of metacognition. So with his support, he then decided his job was to design learning and teaching environments and tasks that would enable his students to exhibit great algebraist thinking and communication and behaviour. And he papered one wall of the classroom entirely with brown paper and split it up into areas. And he asked his students, for example, one of the things the great algebraists did was write down their thinking. And he asked the students to do this, and then he would blow a whistle at random moments, and they'd all have to come and pin their work on the board and take somebody else's down and finish the problem. A riot, absolutely a riot first time they did this. Everybody hadn't written their thinking down, and they instantly knew why it was important to write the thinking down so that they could build on someone else's thinking and find their way into it. And so that was one example, lots of other things he did. Students were encouraged to, the minute they got stuck, to pin their work and their thinking up on the board for other people to come and help them with the thinking. Their questions were the property of the class, the community of algebraists. They had to offer feedback to other people on their problems, and they had to seek it out from each other. And when they'd finished the thinking, that work was up on the board, and they were invited to come and see the patterns in the thinking. What are the patterns in the solution? What are the patterns in the thinking? And how do those things, how are they similar and how are they different? And they would record the results, and at the end of the lesson, the pupils and Alf would look together at all the mathematical algebraic thinking in the lesson and work out what they needed to do next. And after 15 weeks, this year 7 class all got very successful results in a GCS paper, algebra questions. This was a mixed ability class in a very tough comprehensive. But the children were also already going into other classes and starting to use algebra and geography. In fact, the geography teacher turned up in his lesson one day saying, I'm not really sure my algebra's up to this, and anyway, I need to see what they're doing. Can I sit in? So the children really had they got good grades in GCSE algebra in year 7. Okay, that's a context for the things I want to say. So EEF guidance on metacognition, there's not much I need to say. We've gone over this ground in lots and lots of ways today. But just a quick summary. We need to model our thinking. It's no good keeping our thinking in here. It has to be visible. We have to share it. We have to make it a tool for collaborative learning. And we have to model. We always modeled, but what all the metacognitive, cognitive science research tells us is how important that is, and to make it really, really visible. We do need to set challenges. They have to be motivating, have to be engaging, and they have to be the kind of challenges that enable pupils gradually to increase their self-regulation and metacognition. We have to develop and promote metacognitive talk, and we have to get students organised. You can see all of that in Alf's classroom, all of that brilliantly in Alf's classroom. I just want to zoom in on what this means in particular subjects, because what we always do when we do systematic reviews is we generalise and it gets abstract. Sometimes it really matters to see how it's nuanced, doesn't it, in a particular subject. So if we look at the great randomized control trials done by Shea and Adey, long time ago now, but I think this still stands the test of time in many ways too. This is how they thought that evidence was organised. They talked about concrete preparation. Really need to work in very concrete ways so students reveal what they know and understand already. You need to do that so you understand the wicked learning problems before you tackle them. They talked about the importance of cognitive conflict, which isn't everyone having a fight. It's about everybody having a chance to work with ideas that are in tension with each other, but especially ideas that are in tension with things we've learned before. Social construction, right back to talk and the importance of it, to construct new joint understandings. Lots of that going around on those brown paper walls. A purpose here. What's the point of the talk? We can all talk for Britain. The point of the talk is for them to turn their thinking into more structured reasoning that helps them dial it in so they can bring it back and use it later. What's the purpose of the metacognitive activities? What's the purpose of the talk? Bridging, they talked about, which was the conscious transfer. Now, here's something that I found really lovely in this work, which is of a reasoning pattern. That's the thing to think about. What are the reasoning patterns at different stages in children's learning? What does reasoning look like? It's going on in our very early years children. It's going on in different phases and contexts, but the reasoning patterns are the helpful thing to hang on to. How do we move from that to generalization and consolidation? So there we are. Those are two takes on metacognition. Now, this map that I was talking about developing CPDL effectively, from developing great teaching that David talked about earlier, we have to focus continuing professional development and learning when it's the and learning bit, not just the stuff we do on a day like today where there's a lot of transmission, but the learning where we take it away afterwards, on deep understanding of who teachers are, and that was coming out very strongly in what Jay just did. We know that all of this only works when we connect it with how teachers want their learners' learning to look if their own learning is successful. That's different from needs. It's different from student needs. It's suppler and subtler, and it's more aspirational. What do we want our learners' learning to look like if our learning from research and evidence is successful? We have to think about developing theory alongside content and pedagogy, and make extensive use of formative assessments. This is all beginning to sound like teachers doing self-regulation and all those things we're wanting our students to do, to connect new and existing learning. And we have to think really hard about teacher dialogue. The systematic reviews about research are really clear. Professional dialogue does not by any means always work. There are lots and lots and lots of trials of using professional dialogue between teachers to enhance student and teacher learning. And it only works when the dialogue is rooted in disturbing the status quo, trying new things, taking the risk, two of us looking vulnerable together so we keep each other's going, and at the same time when the thing we're talking about isn't just our teaching, but it's how our students are responding to our learning and the changes we make. So we have to root dialogue in trying new things, cognitive load, cognitive tension. So I've made a couple of tables here, and I'll do a row, but they'll be in the presentation. The presentation's on the Cure website, but Searle will have it somewhere soon or wherever. But I think when we look at this coming together, we get some interesting things happening. For EEF's guidance, we're talking about teaching metacognitive strategies, including how to organise, plan, monitor, evaluate. In CANE, helping pupils to articulate their own reasoning, to understand and internalise it, use it later. These are similar, but they're just shades of it for a particular context. In CPDL, that starts to look like working through structured protocols. Some talk about instructional coaching, some talk about specialist coaching, some talk about mentoring, some talk about collaborative inquiry, some talk about lesson study. These are protocols for embedding in structured learning all the ingredients we need for successful professional learning. and increasing independent experimentation and reflection. This reflection point is hugely important. Colvan again was making that point. There's the activating prior knowledge, which turns into concrete preparation, and has this extra layer on it for teachers. Teachers aren't just learning to be more knowledgeable themselves, they're learning to put their learning at the service of their students. So we have to connect that with their aspirations for their pupils and students. There's modelling. We've known about modelling for forever. Formative assessment is incredibly powerful in teacher learning, and we very often don't apply a lot of what we know about formative assessment to the way we design and scaffold support for teacher learning. We have to think about the challenges we set when we're wanting metacognitive control. And in teacher learning, I think this is very often that phase when we're helping teachers to understand why it works here, but not there for this apparently similar group of students. And why it doesn't work, and why it does work for these very different groups of students. It's the similarities and the difference. Lots and lots of people who teach metacognition use odd one out. So I still think it's a great way into this understanding of why things do and don't work. And the reason we do that in professional learning is that if we don't help teachers develop a practical theory, otherwise known as metacognitive control, I would argue, when they're encountering new approaches, they're given a recipe which leaves them paralysed in doing it in the way they first encounter it, and doesn't put them in the position of skilled professional of interpreting that for different contexts. And then the point about dialogue. So a quick look at the map of effective leaders of great CPDL. Here are a couple of things. The first thing we found from this map is the people who lead this, like John and others, and Jade who've been talking today, they position continuing professional development and learning as everyone taking shared responsibility for excellence in pupil achievement and well-being. You've heard a lot of that today. We thought it was very exciting for the first time to have hard evidence of the nice kind about well-being being as important, student well-being. If we don't support teachers and give them time to think about the impact of new approaches on student well-being, pupil well-being, as well as their progress, they'll have to do that anyway. So, and that might get muddled, if you don't give them time to think about that. And for teachers, there's a parallel. We have to focus not only on teachers' progress and their developing skills, knowledge and understanding, we have to focus on their professional growth, individually and collectively. How as a team do we become ambassadors for research and evidence-informed learning and for the science of learning? So we have to promote professional learning as a professional responsibility. And we have the Robinson findings we've gone over several times. We've got to model openness to deep professional and leadership learning. And here's the thing, curriculum development's one of the best vehicles for driving that forward. The intellectual work John was sharing with us, that's a great moment for thinking about metacognition. Last things in purple that really struck me as resonant with his point about metacognition. The map tells us that what's crucial in leading effective professional learning is making sure that all the things we put in place help teachers manage complexity. Because it will be complicated. I know there's the what was John's word? Simploxity. No. Simplexity. I know he was trying to combine those things, but they are both there. And so as leaders, we have to help teachers manage the complexity. And one of the ways that we do that, hidden away in one of the Robinson appendices, Appendix 5, I think, is that we need to create tools and protocols that help teachers manage the cognitive load new professional learning is placing on them. We're asking them to do stuff. Let's make sure we do that well. The practical load, we're getting better at that. But also the emotional load. Professional learning of the kind everyone's been talking about today is hard emotional work too. It means unlearning things. It means letting go of props and so on. So we've got to think more about those dimensions of professional learning. There's lots of importance about recognizing and mobilizing specialist contributions because they enable depth. They enable us to see the cognitive conflict, the cognitive tensions that we're working through, and emphasize practical theory. last point here, doing it quickly, we looked at effective research, leadership of effective curriculum development. There isn't any that has any student impact data. All of the studies about effective curriculum development stop at teacher impacts. But all of the reviews about effective leadership of CPDL have big sections on curriculum development because it's such a powerful engine. And here's the thing that resonates so much with what John said. One of the things this map advocates for so strongly is enabling every leader to take a step back and do the metacognitive work on how their own in-depth specialist knowledge has helped them develop as an educator and a leader. Not as an end in itself, but to bring to the surface their awareness of the contribution that depth makes to their own metacognition that enables them to lead in the way they're leading, and to know how to locate and use it in other people. How can I find out and discover the specialist knowledge in you? I didn't know what John was going to say, but that finding takes us there. I had some questions, which if I've got it at the end, I'll go back to. I just want to make this point, that in South Korea, there are people, if you are a High Court judge, you are a failed applicant for teacher training. Just think about that. And if you're one of these absolute leading edge people who get to do teacher training, you will be taught, you'll do a 3-part degree, you'll learn your subject, you'll learn at degree level about pedagogic content knowledge, and you'll learn about pedagogic skills. But you know what will glue all that together from day one? From day one, you are asked to use textbooks to critique whether any of it is any good. Any of it is any good for a specific group of skilled disappearing learners, of talented ahead of the street learners, of struggling learners, of the wonderful Bolshi learners, all of those. They're asked from day one to critique all this. Now, South Korea has a textbook museum, right? It isn't that they think all textbooks should be in the museum. They think that textbooks and having multiple ones of them that are really well thought through are what give teachers the environment in which to be really critical metacognitive practitioners. So I've got 1 second left. There we are, done.